Watch your mouth, old man. Officer Dale Krieger shoved him against the mailbox. The cane clattered to the sidewalk. Pick it up, the old man said evenly. Something about his stillness unsettled Krieger. People didn't talk to Dale Krieger like that, not twice. You giving me lip now? I'm asking you once to hand me back my cane. And I'm telling you I don't repeat myself for men hiding behind a badge. His jaw tightened. Some old instinct told him to slow down. He didn't listen to it. Pride always won with Krieger. He grabbed the old man's collar. Careful, boy. Big mistake, old-timer. Phones rose along the porches. Nobody moved to help, and Theodore Marsh stood as straight as his 81-year-old spine allowed, breathing slow, steady, under the officer's grip. Have you ever watched a man get erased in broad daylight by someone who never once asked what he'd given for this country? The morning it happened, Cedar Hollow had the kind of stillness only small southern towns keep, a stillness that hides more than it shows. Same brick storefronts along Main Street, same church bell ringing at 9, same porches with rocking chairs that had rocked since before anyone could remember. Theodore Marsh had lived on Willow Lane for 43 years, in a house he built with his own hands after 2 tours in Vietnam and a career that followed it. 26 years total, retiring as a command sergeant major, the highest enlisted rank a soldier can hold. Nobody on Willow Lane called him that. To most of them he was just the old man who mowed his lawn in perfect diagonal stripes and waved at children on their bikes. He had walked to the corner store that morning the way he walked most mornings, slow but deliberate, his cane tapping a familiar rhythm against the concrete. He wore a faded grey cardigan over a collared shirt, pressed the way a man presses a shirt when pressing things has been a discipline for 60 years. His silver hair was cut close, military short the way it had been since 1967. A thin scar ran along his left forearm, souvenir of a night in the Central Highlands he did not discuss. On his wrist, a plain steel watch, scratched from decades of wear, the kind a man is issued, not the kind he buys for himself. He was going to get flowers. Today was the anniversary of his wife Loretta's passing. 4 years now, and every year on this date he walked to Miller's corner store, bought a small bundle of white carnations, her favorite, and drove them out to the cemetery at the edge of town. He had done this every year without fail, rain or shine, cane or no cane. He intended to do it again. Nobody on Willow Lane knew what Theodore Marsh had once commanded. They didn't know about the Silver Star, folded in a cedar box in his closet, or the 2 Purple Hearts, or the years he'd spent afterward training young soldiers who still called him Sergeant Major out of pure reflex whenever they crossed paths. To the town, he was simply an old black man who lived alone since his wife died and kept mostly to himself. Across the street, leaning against his patrol cruiser with a coffee cup in hand, Officer Dale Krieger watched him approach. Krieger was 34, built wide through the chest, the kind of man who filled a doorway before he filled a room. He had worn the badge for 9 years in Cedar Hollow, and in that time he had developed a particular instinct, a radar for who belonged on these streets and who, in his mind, did not. Nobody had ever challenged it, because people in Cedar Hollow had learned a long time ago not to challenge Dale Krieger. His real file wasn't official. It lived in the town's memory, in the way certain families crossed the street at the sight of his cruiser, in the way certain porches went silent when he drove past slow, elbow out the window, like he owned every square foot of asphalt in the county. Theodore reached the corner and paused at the crosswalk. Waiting for the light, his cane planted firmly against the pavement, Krieger pushed off his cruiser and started walking, unhurried, the way a predator doesn't hurry when it already believes it has won. "Morning," Theodore said politely as the officer approached, because that was how he had raised himself to greet people, uniform or not. "You always cross here?" Krieger asked, stopping 2 feet closer than a stranger should stand. "Every morning for 43 years, Theodore answered. "We've had thefts on this block," Krieger said, eyes moving over the cardigan, the cane, the neat crease of his slacks. People calling in about somebody loitering. Watching houses. I'm not loitering, son. I'm walking to buy flowers. You got ID on you? I've walked this street since before you were born, Theodore said, calm as still water. I don't carry papers to buy carnations. Something flickered behind Krieger's eyes, not recognition, just irritation. The particular irritation of a man who expects folding and gets none. You being smart with me, old man? I'm being honest with you, officer. There's a difference. He didn't like honest. Honest meant a man wasn't afraid. And men who weren't afraid made Krieger feel smaller than he wanted to feel in front of the two teenagers now watching from the corner store steps. Phones already half raised out of pure habit. A woman walking her dog slowed her steps. An elderly man on the porch across the street set down his newspaper. Nobody said anything yet, but the street had gone quieter, the way a room goes quiet before a storm nobody's named yet. Where you headed exactly? Krieger pressed. Miller's, then the cemetery, if that's your business. Everything on this street is my business. Krieger stepped in closer. You got a problem answering a simple question? No problem at all. I answered it. Twice now. The second answer was, what did it? Something in Krieger's chest tightened. The old familiar heat of a man who had never once, in 9 years, been made to feel like the smaller person in an exchange. And here was an 81-year-old man in a cardigan doing it without raising his voice. Hand me that cane, Krieger said suddenly. Theodore blinked. Excuse me. I said hand it over, Ed. Man your age walking around here with a weapon, I want to see it. This is a cane, son. It's how I walk. It's a weapon until I say otherwise. Krieger reached out and yanked it from Theodore's grip. The old man staggered, one step, catching himself against the mailbox post, his hand slapping flat against the metal to keep from going down. The cane clattered onto the sidewalk, spinning once before it stopped. Pick it up, Theodore said. His voice did not rise, but it did not waver either. You giving me orders now? Krieger's voice climbed. People didn't talk to Dale Krieger like that. He wasn't used to it, and being unused to something. For a man like Krieger, always curdled fast into fury. I'm asking you once, and I'm telling you I don't repeat myself for men who hide behind a badge. The words landed exactly where Theodore meant them to. Krieger's jaw locked. A quiet, older instinct in him, the one buried under 9 years of unchecked power, flickered a warning. Slow down. He silenced it the way he silenced every warning that had ever come before it. Pride always won with Krieger. He grabbed Theodore's collar, twisting the cardigan tight in his fist. You watch your mouth, old man. Or what? Theodore asked, still steady, still upright despite the grip yanking at his collar. Despite the ache already blooming in the shoulder, he'd shattered once outside Da Nang and never fully repaired. Phones rose along the porches now, along the corner store steps, one after another, screens catching the morning light. Nobody stepped forward. A town that had learned, over 9 years, exactly how far Dale Krieger's temper could reach, and exactly how little the badge above his heart would ever cost him, watched in the particular paralysis of people who have seen this before, and never once seen it end differently. Krieger shoved him. Theodore's back hit the mailbox post hard enough to rattle the metal door. He did not cry out. He straightened his spine as much as 81 years and a bad hip would allow, and looked the younger man dead in the eye. I served this country for 26 years, Theodore said quietly. I buried friends in 3 different wars this town never had to think about, and you are going to put your hands on me over a cane and a walk to buy my wife flowers. Turn around, Krieger snapped, unhooking the cuffs from his belt. Resisting disorderly conduct. You want to keep running your mouth? I'll add obstruction. I have not raised my voice once, Theodore said. And it was true. Every phone on that street would prove it true. I have not moved from this spot except when you shoved me into it. Turn around. He turned Theodore roughly by the shoulder. The bad shoulder, and the old man's breath caught audibly, a small sound of real pain that seemed to embarrass nobody but the people forced to hear it. Krieger yanked one wrist back, then the other, and the cuffs bit down hard enough to leave marks that would still be visible 2 days later. "You're hurting me," Theodore said. No panic in it, just fact, the way he'd have reported a broken piece of equipment 40 years earlier. "Should have thought of that before you got smart," Krieger said, pressing a hand flat between the old man's shoulder blades and walking him toward the cruiser. "Sir, he's not resisting," the boy from the corner store called out. Phone still raised, voice cracking with the particular courage of a 17-year-old who has never before spoken up to a man like this. "You can see he's not resisting." "Get back," Krieger barked without turning. The dog walker had her phone up too now, hand pressed over her mouth. The man on the porch across the street stood at his railing, newspaper forgotten on the chair behind him, filming with hands that visibly shook. Nobody intervened, nobody dared, but nobody lowered their phones either, and in a town that had spent 9 years learning to look away from Dale Krieger, that quiet refusal to stop filming was the smallest kind of courage. It would turn out to be enough. Krieger folded Theodore into the back of the cruiser, one hand pressing down on the old man's silver head, harder than necessary, the door slamming with a finality that seemed to echo down the whole street. Through the window, Theodore watched the corner store, the mailbox, the small crowd already dispersing into private conversations and raised phones, and he did what he had trained himself to do decades earlier in far worse rooms than the back of a Cedar Hollow patrol car. He breathed, in through the nose, out slow, counting the way men had taught him to count in places this town could never imagine. He let his shoulders settle. He let the pain in his arm sit where it was without letting it own him. He thought of Loretta, of the carnations still uncollected on the corner store rack, and he waited, calm as a held breath, for the truth to do what it always eventually did. At the station, the smell was burnt coffee and old floor wax, same as every small-town precinct in America. Krieger walked him in through the side door, one hand still gripping his shoulder, though Theodore had made no move to resist since the cuffs went on. A dispatcher glanced up, then looked quickly back down, the reflex of someone who has learned not to ask questions about how Dale Krieger brings people in. He sat Theodore on a metal bench bolted to the wall and went to his desk to build his report. 2 fingers on the keyboard, eyes flicking up now and then, like the old man was a loose end rather than a human being. Disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, failure to identify, Krieger muttered as he typed, each line entering the system clean, official, and entirely false. "I'd like a phone call," Theodore said. "You'll get one when I say." "I'd also like you to know," Theodore continued, voice level, "that every person on that street was filming. All of it. From the moment you took my cane." Krieger's fingers paused over the keys for half a second before resuming. Faster now, the particular speed of a man trying to outrun a thought he doesn't want to finish, doesn't change what goes in this report. "No," Theodore agreed, "but it changes what happens after." He said nothing else. He had learned, across 2 wars and 26 years of quiet leadership, that the surest way to lose an argument was to raise your voice inside it. So he sat, spine straight despite the ache, wrists raw beneath the cuffs, and waited. Behind the front counter, a younger officer named Priya Anand had watched the whole exchange with a knot tightening in her stomach. 2 years on the force, she had grown used to looking away from things Krieger did, the way everyone in the building had, folder after folder disappearing into a basement cabinet with 2 words scrawled across the top: "No further action." But something about the old man on the bench, the stillness, the dignity, sat wrong in a place she hadn't examined in years. She crossed to the property counter where Krieger had dropped a small plastic bag without a second glance. A wallet, keys, a folded photograph of a woman in a yellow dress. She told herself she was simply logging evidence. That was half true. She opened the wallet. A driver's license sat behind the plastic window, and behind that, tucked into a second slot, a laminated card far stiffer and more official than anything the county DMV had ever produced. She tilted it toward the light. Her breath caught. It was a veteran's identification card, and across the top, beside a photograph of a much younger Theodore Marsh in dress uniform, sat a rank insignia she recognized instantly from her own cousin's years in the army. The crossed rifles and star of a command sergeant major, the very top of the enlisted ranks, a title so rare most soldiers serve entire careers without meeting a man who holds it. Behind it sat a Silver Star commendation card dated 1969, and a photograph, soft at the corners, of a much younger Theodore beside 3 soldiers in a jungle clearing, all of them grinning despite everything the picture didn't show. Priya looked up slowly across the room. Theodore was already looking back at her, his expression unreadable, patient. "You found it," he said quietly. She swallowed. "Sergeant Major, Please," he said, gentle despite everything. "Think carefully about what you do next." Her hand went to the radio clipped to her shoulder and hovered there, unsteady. This was not a call for the open channel, not something to be broadcast across the whole county before anyone understood what it meant. She lowered her hand instead, closed the wallet around its cards, and walked it across the room to Krieger's desk. "Dale," she said, "you need to look at this." "Kinda busy," he muttered, not looking up. "Look now!" Something in her voice, careful and taut in a way he'd never heard from her, made him glance up despite himself. He took the wallet with the irritation of a man expecting to be unimpressed and flipped it open. He read the license first, the name meaning nothing to him. Men like Krieger rarely learned the names of the people they stepped on. Then Priya slid the second card forward, and Krieger went still. The insignia sat there, unmistakable, matte gold against worn plastic. Beneath it, a citation date, a unit designation, 2 tours in a place he'd only ever seen in documentaries. On the back, a full list of decorations, 2 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, a Bronze Star with Valor, a Combat Infantryman badge. The blood left his face slowly. All the small details he'd chosen not to see came rushing back. The pressed collar, the military short haircut, the scarred forearm, the eyes that had never once flickered with the fear he'd expected. He had cuffed an 81-year-old command sergeant major for the crime of answering him honestly, and 40 phones had captured every second of it. The front desk phone rang. The dispatcher answered it in the bored half-attention of a routine Tuesday, then sat bolt upright halfway through the second sentence. "Yes, sir, yes, hold on, let me—" She covered the receiver, her voice coming out thin. "It's the County Veterans Affairs Office. They're saying a Sergeant Major Marsh missed a scheduled call-in with his physical therapist this morning, and a neighbor reported seeing him taken in cuffs. They want to know if we have him." The room went quiet in the particular way that has nothing to do with volume. Krieger stood frozen at his desk, the wallet still open in his hand, the gold insignia staring back up at him. On the bench, Theodore rose to his feet. He did it slowly, without drama, the cuffs still biting into wrists that had earned every grey hair on his head twice over, and yet the whole room turned toward him as if drawn by something magnetic. "My name," he said, "is Command Sergeant Major Theodore Marsh, United States Army, retired. I served 26 years. This morning I was walking to buy flowers for my late wife's grave." Nobody breathed. "I was stopped without cause. My cane was taken from me and thrown to the ground. I was shoved, cuffed with unnecessary force against a shoulder injury I have carried since 1968, and charged with crimes I did not commit. All of it recorded by more cameras than this department apparently anticipated." His eyes found Krieger and held there, calm and immovable. "Take these off," he said, lifting his wrists slightly. "And then nobody touches anything else on that desk. Every report, every log, every recording from this morning is now evidence." For a long moment, Krieger didn't move. The whole architecture of 9 years spent as the biggest man in every room collapsing in real time. It was Priya who crossed to him, hands trembling as she unlocked the cuffs. They came away with a soft double click. Theodore rubbed his wrists once, slow, the red marks plainly visible for every phone in the building. "Thank you, Officer Anand," he said quietly. He had read her name the moment he sat down. He read everything. Outside, the story had already outgrown Cedar Hollow. The boy's video from the corner store, the cane hitting the pavement, Theodore's calm voice repeating, "I have not moved," had crossed 200,000 views before Krieger finished typing his false report, and it kept climbing through the afternoon. A caption ran beneath a freeze frame of the old man's face, pressed with quiet dignity against the mailbox. "Decorated veteran, 81, cuffed for asking an officer to pick up his cane." National outlets picked it up by evening. Local news vans arrived by morning. 2 hours east, a woman named Renata Cole saw the clip on her lunch break and called her supervisor immediately. Renata was a senior investigator with the state's Office of Professional Conduct, the body responsible for reviewing serious complaints against law enforcement, and 11 years in the job had taught her to recognize, within seconds, when a story was bigger than the town it happened in. She arrived in Cedar Hollow the next morning with a badge in one hand and a list in the other. "I want every incident report filed yesterday," she told the desk sergeant. "Every body camera, worn or not, dispatch logs, the full personnel file for Officer Krieger, and I want him in a room by himself in 10 minutes. Nobody argued. The chief, a heavy-set man named Walter Suggs, who had spent 15 years quietly signing off on complaints against Krieger with the same 2 words each time, had stopped pretending he ran his own department the moment the state car pulled into the lot. Renata found Theodore in a side office, a cup of untouched coffee in front of him, his cardigan still creased despite everything. She sat across from him. "You could press this a dozen different ways. Sergeant Major," she said, "some would end his career by tonight. Tell me how you want it handled." Theodore considered the question the way he considered most things, slowly and completely. "By the book," he said finally. "I don't want the fast answer. I want the true one. If you cut a corner to help me, this town learns the wrong lesson, and the next man on that sidewalk, without 4 decades of medals in his wallet, won't have anyone coming to save him." Renata studied him for a long moment, then nodded. It was the answer she had hoped for. The investigation began with the body camera. Krieger's footage showed the walk-up, showed the first exchange of words, and then, at the exact moment the encounter turned physical, went dark. The timestamp of the shutoff sat plainly in the metadata. "He'll say it malfunctioned," Renata said. "Then we show him the part where it didn't," Theodore answered, "because the boy from the corner store had caught it on his own phone." Krieger's hand rising to his chest, 2 fingers finding the small camera clipped there, the tiny light blinking from red to dark in perfect, unmistakable focus. Laid side by side with the department's dead footage, the malfunction stopped looking accidental and started looking exactly like what it was, a choice. Next came the written report. Krieger had claimed Theodore resisted, that he raised his cane in a threatening manner, that he refused repeatedly to identify himself. Renata set the document beside 4 separate witness videos. In none of them did Theodore raise his cane. In none of them did he pull away from the officer's grip. In every one of them, his voice could be heard calm and clear, repeating the same handful of words, "I have not moved from this spot." The report and the footage could not both be true. The footage did not blink. Then Renata pulled the file nobody in Cedar Hollow had ever wanted opened, the thick, Yellowed folder from the basement cabinet with Dale Krieger's name across the tab. Inside sat 9 years of complaints. A delivery driver made to kneel on a curb over a broken taillight. A teenager slammed against a fence for walking home after dark. A grandmother handcuffed in her own driveway over a mistaken address. Each complaint closed with the same 2 words in the same practiced hand. No further action. Chief Walter Suggs. The pattern had a name now, and it wasn't only Krieger's. By the following morning, the consequences had begun moving under their own weight. The mayor, who had spent a decade praising the department at ribbon cuttings, called an emergency press conference. Krieger was suspended without pay, pending the outcome of the state investigation. Chief Suggs was placed on administrative leave. Reporters asked who had forced the sudden transparency. Nobody at the podium said the words, "Command Sergeant Major." Nobody needed to. Every phone in America that had watched the clip already knew. In the days that followed, something began happening in Cedar Hollow that hadn't happened in 9 years. People started talking. The delivery driver came forward first, then the teenager's mother, then the grandmother carrying a photograph she'd kept hidden for years. Afraid no one would believe an old woman's word against a badge. One after another, they sat with Renata and told stories they had carried alone, each ending the same way. A complaint filed, a complaint buried, a person who learned to stop complaining. Theodore sat in on several of those conversations, not to perform, not for the cameras gathering outside, but because he understood, better than most, what it meant to finally be believed. When the grandmother finished her account, hands shaking around a coffee cup, Theodore reached across the table and covered her hands with his own, the same wrists that had worn Krieger's cuffs 2 days earlier. "It wasn't only you," he told her quietly, "and it won't be buried this time. You have my word." That was the true turn in the story. Not the rank, not the state investigator, not even the millions of views. It was a room full of people who had spent years being told they'd imagined what happened to them. Finally hearing someone with standing say out loud, "I believe you." The case against Krieger built the way a wall builds, one verified fact at a time. The shut-off timestamp, the contradicted report, the pattern of buried complaints stretching back 9 years, each signature leading directly to the chief's desk. Charges followed: assault under color of law, filing a false police report, tampering with recorded evidence. Suggs faced his own reckoning for the decade and a half of cover-ups that had let it continue unchecked. His signature on 40-plus dismissed complaints became, in the end, its own case entirely. The hearing came that winter. By then, Main Street looked nothing like the quiet town Theodore had walked through that morning 8 months earlier. News vans lined the courthouse steps. The benches inside filled with familiar faces. The delivery driver, the teenager and his mother, the grandmother, all of them finally counted. Krieger sat at the defense table in a plain suit instead of a uniform. The badge had been taken weeks earlier in a quiet office, without any of the swagger he'd worn that morning on Willow Lane. Stripped of it, he looked considerably smaller than the man who had once filled every doorway in Cedar Hollow. The evidence went in piece by piece. The boy's video, the dead body camera, the false report read aloud beside the footage that broke each claim apart. When the courtroom watched Theodore's cane clatter to the pavement, his voice steady beneath it, "I have not moved from this spot." The room went as silent as the station had gone 8 months before. Krieger was convicted on all 3 counts. The sentence carried real time, not administrative leave, dressed up as consequence. He would never wear a badge again in that state, or any other that checked its registries. When the verdict was read, he lowered his head the way the people he had once stopped were made to lower theirs. Chief Suggs resigned before the department could remove him, but resignation didn't shield him from what followed. The department was placed under a state-mandated oversight agreement. Cameras that could no longer be switched off in the field, an independent civilian board to review every complaint, one with no basement cabinet to lose them in. The two words Suggs had written so many times, "no further action," were retired from the department's vocabulary for good. Officer Priya Anand kept her position. The State Board found she had done exactly what the badge was supposed to require. She had looked at something wrong and refused to call it right. She was later asked to help design the department's new bias and de-escalation training, a role she accepted without hesitation. The grandmother received a formal letter on real department letterhead, correcting the record from years earlier. It was long overdue, and she cried reading it on her porch anyway. Because overdue, she said, still isn't the same as never. Theodore stood at the back of the courtroom for the verdict. He had given his account plainly when asked and stepped down without seeking the spotlight the case had built around him. When it was over, he walked out through the same courthouse doors he'd passed 100 times before anyone in Cedar Hollow knew his name. And a reporter caught him on the steps, asking if he felt vindicated. Theodore considered the word the way he considered most things. "This was never about me," he said finally. "I carried a rank in my wallet that most men never earn, and it's what saved me that morning. The people in this courtroom didn't carry anything like that. And the law worked for them anyway, eventually. That's the only part worth being proud of." He did not repeat what Krieger had said to him outside the mailbox. He didn't need to. The whole season had answered it for him. He drove out to Miller's Corner store that afternoon. The same one, the flower rack restocked with white carnations exactly where it had always stood. The owner, a woman named Ruth, who had watched the whole thing unfold from her front window that morning 8 months earlier, wouldn't take his money. Theodore set the bills on the counter anyway and told her to give the next bundle to whoever needed them most. He drove to the cemetery at the edge of town, where a maple tree had grown taller since his last visit. Loretta Marsh, beloved wife, 1944-2020. He knelt, slower than he used to. The cane he'd fought to get back, cracked now but repaired, refusing to replace it, planted firmly in the grass beside him, and laid the carnations down. "I made it," he said quietly. "Took a little longer than I planned, but I made it." The wind moved through the maple. It was answer enough. He thought about the rule his own father had given him on a porch in rural Georgia 60 years earlier, long before Vietnam, long before the rank, long before any of it. Stand tall, stay calm. Let them underestimate you, and let the truth do the rest. His father had meant it as a way to survive a world that wasn't built for men like them. Theodore had used it, in the end, as a way to change a small piece of it. Back in town, the work continued without his name attached to most of it. The new Civilian Oversight Board took its first cases that spring. Priya Anand stood in front of a room of new recruits and told them about a morning she would never forget and what it costs to look away from something wrong simply because the man doing it wears the same uniform you do. None of those recruits carried a silver star in their wallet. That was, in the end, the entire point. The system was learning slowly to work for the people who don't. Months later, a young officer on a routine patrol stopped an elderly man walking home from the pharmacy. He asked the man's name first. He listened to the answer. It sounds like a small thing. In Cedar Hollow, it was everything. So let me ask you, have you ever watched someone get erased in front of you and wished afterward that you had said something? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that one person refusing to look away can be enough. Like this video, so more people find it. And subscribe, because the next story is one you'll want to be here for. Some people in that town will never look at a badge or an old man walking slowly down their street the same way again. And that, in the end, is the only kind of justice that actually lasts.